Camp Clinton POW Facility, Mississippi, August 14, 1943. Oberleutnant Friedrich von Steinberg stands in the recreation barracks of the prisoner of war camp, arms crossed, expression carefully neutral as an American soldier sets up a phonograph. Friedrich is 28 years old, from a Prussian military family that has produced officers for the Kaiser, the Weimar Republic, and now the Wehrmacht. He has been trained since childhood to recognize military march music, Wagner's operas, Beethoven's symphonies, the cultural canon of Germanic superiority. He has been a prisoner for 3 months, captured in Tunisia when Rommel's Afrika Korps finally collapsed under Allied pressure. He expects to spend the war's remainder in this Mississippi camp surrounded by cotton fields and heat that reminds him of North Africa, but with none of its dignity. The American Guard, a black corporal named William Jackson from Chicago, places a record on the turntable with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. "You gentlemen asked about American music," Jackson says in careful German learned from a phrasebook. "This is American music, this is what we are." The needle drops. For 3 seconds there is only surface noise. Then a voice emerges, raw, aching, carrying centuries of pain transformed into something that transcends language. It is Bessie Smith singing, "Nobody knows you when you're down and out." And Friedrich von Steinberg feels something crack in his understanding of the country that has defeated him. The context of Camp Clinton was complex, a microcosm of contradictions that defined America's relationship with its prisoners and itself. The facility housed approximately 4,000 German POWs, mostly captured in North Africa and Sicily, soldiers who had expected eventual repatriation to a victorious Reich, but were now confronting the reality of German defeat. Under Geneva Convention protocols, the prisoners were housed in reasonable conditions: adequate food, medical care, recreational facilities, work details that paid nominal wages. But they were also subjected to re-education programs designed to introduce democratic values and American culture, programs that most German officers regarded with skepticism, bordering on contempt. Friedrich represented the typical profile of captured German officer, university-educated from military aristocracy, trained to view war as profession governed by codes of honor and strategic logic. He had fought in Poland, France, and North Africa, witnessing German military excellence but also its gradual erosion as the industrial might of Allied powers overwhelmed tactical brilliance. His understanding of America had been shaped by Nazi propaganda, a mongrel nation of racial inferiors, culturally bankrupt, held together only by capitalism's soulless machinery. The Germans called Americans cowboys and gangsters, dismissed their military as amateurish, their culture as derivative European traditions debased by commercialism. But 3 months at Camp Clinton had complicated that narrative. The guards were professional, sometimes friendly. The food was abundant beyond what German civilians were receiving in bombed cities. The camp library contained books, many books, not burned, not censored. And most confusingly, black soldiers served as guards, carried weapons, exercised authority over white German officers. This inverted every racial theory Friedrich had been taught. According to Nazi ideology, Africans were subhuman, incapable of civilization, certainly incapable of authority. Yet here was Corporal Jackson, clearly intelligent, clearly in command, offering to share American music with prisoners who had been taught to despise everything he represented. Friedrich had gathered with 30 other German officers in the recreation barracks that evening, curious despite themselves about what American culture might actually be. They expected military marches, perhaps, or commercialized pop music they could dismiss as superficial. They were prepared to confirm their prejudices, to find evidence that America had technology and numbers but no soul. Corporal Jackson had other plans. He was a musician before the war, had played trumpet in Chicago jazz clubs, understood the power of music to communicate truths that politics obscured. He knew exactly which records to play. Bessie Smith's voice filled the barracks with a quality the German officers had never encountered in music. It wasn't technically perfect by conservatory standards. There were notes that bent in ways classical training would correct, phrasing that violated proper meter. But those imperfections carried emotional authenticity that made formal perfection seem sterile by comparison. Once I lived the life of a millionaire spending my money, I didn't care. Taking my friends out for a good time, buying bootleg liquor, champagne, and wine. Friedrich found himself listening not just to melody but to meaning embedded in how notes were bent, how phrases were shaped by experience rather than notation. This was music that documented something real: poverty, betrayal, resilience, the refusal to be destroyed by circumstances beyond control. Nobody knows you when you're down and out in your pocket, not one penny. And as for friends, you haven't any. The other German officers stood in silence, the usual posture of military bearing maintained, but faces showing concentration that suggested internal processing of something unexpected. Major Werner Koch, a stern Bavarian who had dismissed American culture as jazz nonsense, stood with eyes closed, actually listening. When the song ended, Jackson allowed silence before speaking. "Bessie Smith," he said in his halting German. "She died in 1937. Car accident in Mississippi, not far from here. They say she might have survived, but the white hospital wouldn't treat her because she was black. She bled to death in front of a hospital that had equipment to save her." Friedrich understood this was not just musical performance but testimony, evidence submitted to jury of German prisoners who thought they understood racial theory. Jackson continued, "The blues is music of black Americans, created by people brought here as slaves, freed after our Civil War but never truly free. It's music of suffering that doesn't ask for pity, music that transforms pain into something beautiful. This is American culture, not Hollywood, not skyscrapers. This." He played another record, Robert Johnson, Crossroad Blues, then Leadbelly, Where Did You Sleep Last Night? Each song added layers to picture of America more complex than propaganda had suggested. A nation carrying profound contradictions, capable of creating beauty from injustice, producing art from experiences the Germans had been taught were beneath cultural consideration. Friedrich felt his carefully constructed understanding beginning to fracture, not dramatically but with small cracks that suggested larger structural problems. After the third song, Major Koch spoke. His German was formal, translated by a bilingual prisoner. "Corporal Jackson, I have question. This music you play, it is music of oppressed people, yes? People who suffer under American racial system?" "Yes, sir," Jackson replied, the "sir" carrying complex irony. A black corporal addressing a German major as superior while simultaneously being his captor. "Then why do you fight for this America? Why do you wear uniform of country that treats your people as inferior?" It was the logical question, the one that seemed to expose American hypocrisy. Jackson had clearly heard it before and had prepared his answer not through rhetoric but through more music. He played a record by Louis Armstrong. What a Wonderful World hadn't been written yet, so instead he chose Armstrong's When It's Sleepy Time Down South. But first he spoke. "You ask why I fight for America. I ask you, do you fight only for countries that are perfect, or do you fight for countries that could be better? My grandfather was slave. My father was born free but couldn't vote in Mississippi. I can vote now but I can't eat at white restaurants in this town. America is hypocrite, yes, but America also allows me to say that, to fight to change it, to believe it can become the place it claims to be. Can you say same about Germany?" The question hung in the barracks like smoke. The German officers, trained in military discipline and ideological certainty, had no ready answer. Friedrich realized the trap. Nazi Germany demanded total ideological conformity, eliminated dissent, claimed perfection through racial purity. America, for all its failures, at least acknowledged possibility of improvement. Jackson continued, "The blues exist because black Americans could sing about suffering without being executed for criticizing society. Could your musicians sing about problems in Germany? Could they write songs about hunger, about fear, about disagreeing with government?" More silence. Friedrich thought of the tight control of culture in Germany, the burning of degenerate books and music, the exile or elimination of artists who questioned Nazi ideology. The comparison was uncomfortable. "This music," Jackson said, gesturing to the phonograph, "is proof that freedom and oppression can exist simultaneously in same country, and that the freedom part, even incomplete freedom, produces art that totalitarianism cannot match. You hear pain in this music, yes, but you also hear hope. Totalitarianism can produce military marches. Only partial freedom produces blues." Over the following weeks, the evening music sessions became regular events. Corporal Jackson brought different records each time, carefully curating a curriculum of American musical education: Delta blues, Chicago blues, early jazz, gospel music, work songs. Each genre carried historical and cultural information that contradicted what the German officers had been taught about American civilization. Friedrich found himself attending every session, initially telling himself it was anthropological curiosity, but gradually admitting it was something deeper. The music was reaching places that propaganda had sealed off, asking questions he had been trained not to ask. One evening, Jackson played recordings of prison work songs, chain gang chants recorded in southern prisons. The rhythms were designed to coordinate labor, but the lyrics documented injustice with such clarity that several German officers shifted uncomfortably. "You hear this," Jackson said, "and you understand that America contains both oppression and the willingness to document that oppression." These recordings were made by white folklorists from Library of Congress who wanted to preserve this music. Government-funded project. Can you imagine your government funding project to document suffering of people it oppresses? Major Koch asked. But if your government knows this injustice exists, why does it not stop it? Because America is not one thing, Jackson explained. It is argument between its ideals and its practices. Constant argument. The music is part of that argument. Evidence submitted to the conscience of the nation. Sometimes the argument moves toward justice. Sometimes it moves backward. But the argument continues because there is freedom to argue. Friedrich spoke for the first time during these sessions, his English better than he usually admitted. In Germany, we were told that freedom is weakness, that democracy is chaos, that only strong leadership and racial purity can create great civilization. But this music, it suggests that suffering and diversity can produce greatness, that homogeneity cannot. Jackson nodded. The blues couldn't exist in racially pure society. It exists because Black Americans and white Americans live together, in tension, in conflict, sometimes in harmony. It's music of mixed experience, not pure experience. Maybe that's actually America's strength, not its weakness. The comment was subversive not through direct political attack but through cultural evidence. The music itself was the argument. Here was art of undeniable power created by people the Germans had been taught to consider inferior. Produced by social conditions the Germans had been told were signs of American degeneracy. Friedrich went to sleep that night humming St. Louis blues and wondering what else he had been wrong about. September 1943. The education deepens. The music sessions expanded beyond blues. Jackson introduced jazz, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Benny Goodman. He explained how jazz was uniquely American art form, born from African rhythms, European harmony, American improvisation, all mixing in New Orleans and spreading across the nation and world. Before the war, Jackson said, American jazz was played in Berlin clubs. Your people loved it until your government declared it degenerate music and banned it. Why do you think your government feared this music? Friedrich had heard jazz in Berlin in the 1930s, in underground clubs that the Nazis eventually shut down. He remembered the energy, the freedom, the sense of rules being joyfully broken and recreated in real time. He understood now what had threatened the regime. Jazz was musical democracy, where individual expression and collective collaboration created something neither could achieve alone. But it was Jackson's introduction to gospel music that created the deepest impact. He played Mahalia Jackson, no relation, her voice filling the barracks with spiritual power that transcended specific religious doctrine. Gospel music, Jackson explained, comes from black churches. It takes European hymns and transforms them into something new. It takes Christian religion that was used to justify slavery and reclaims it as source of liberation. This is American genius, taking what is given to oppress and transforming it into tool of resistance and hope. Major Koch, who had been gradually softening over weeks of exposure to this music, asked, "Your people have suffered under slavery, under Jim Crow laws, under violence, yet this music is not full of hate. Why not? If I were treated as your people have been treated, I would make music of revenge." Jackson smiled. Some blues is about revenge, but mostly it's about surviving with dignity. Hate consumes the person who feels it. Blues transforms pain into art, which means the suffering didn't destroy you. It made you stronger, more human, more capable of beauty. That's victory that revenge can never achieve. Friedrich realized he was witnessing a masterclass in psychological warfare more effective than any propaganda. Jackson wasn't arguing against Nazi ideology directly. He was providing evidence that contradicted its foundations. He was showing German officers trained to believe in racial hierarchy, that the supposedly inferior race had created art the superior race could not match, and he was doing it gently, through music, letting the evidence speak for itself. November 1943. Personal transformations begin. The impact of the music sessions began manifesting in unexpected ways. German officers started requesting specific songs, discussing musical techniques, asking questions about American racial history that went far beyond curiosity into genuine engagement with moral complexity. Friedrich began writing letters home that carefully avoided censorship while hinting at his changing understanding. To his wife Margarete in Munich, he wrote, "The Americans are more complicated than we were told. They have cultural achievements we were taught did not exist. I am learning much, but the most significant transformation was in Major Koch. The stern Bavarian who had dismissed American culture began spending hours in the camp library reading American history, particularly about slavery, Reconstruction, and the ongoing struggle for civil rights. He requested a meeting with Jackson outside the formal music sessions. "I must understand something," Koch said through a translator. "You fight for America despite its treatment of your people. But German propaganda told us that Black Americans would not fight, that they would welcome German liberation from American oppression. This was clearly wrong. Why?" Jackson considered his answer carefully. "Because I understand the difference between imperfect democracy and perfect totalitarianism. Democracy admits its failures and allows struggle for improvement. Totalitarianism claims perfection and crushes anyone who disagrees. I'll take imperfect freedom over perfect slavery every time. But how do you maintain hope when you face discrimination, violence, injustice, the blues?" Jackson said simply. "The music teaches us that suffering is universal, but so is the human capacity to transcend it. Every blues song is evidence that someone survived what seemed unsurvivable. That's hope made audible." Koch was silent for a long moment. "I think perhaps we Germans have forgotten how to acknowledge suffering. We were taught that the strong don't suffer, they dominate. But your music suggests that acknowledging suffering, transforming it into art, is actually the greater strength." It was remarkable admission from officer trained in Nazi ideology of strength through domination. Friedrich, who was present at this conversation, felt he was witnessing something historically significant. The moment when direct exposure to suppressed truth began undermining years of propaganda. That night, Jackson played Billie Holiday singing "Strange Fruit," the haunting protest against lynching. He played it without explanation, letting the lyrics document the horror of American racial violence. When it ended, the barracks was silent for several minutes. Finally, Koch spoke in German. "We have no music like this. We were not allowed to document our nation's crimes through art." January 1944. The music becomes catalyst for deeper change. The camp commander, Colonel Robert Thompson, initially skeptical of Jackson's music sessions, began attending them himself after reports that German POWs were engaging more constructively with re-education programs after exposure to the music. Thompson was pragmatist. Whatever made prisoners more compliant and less hostile was worth supporting, but he also understood he was witnessing something more profound than simple pacification. He watched German officers trained in racial superiority theory, struggling with the cognitive dissonance of recognizing artistic genius in people they had been taught to despise. "Corporal Jackson," Thompson said after one session, "what you're doing here might be more effective than all the formal re-education lectures combined. These men are confronting evidence that contradicts everything they were taught, and they're doing it through beauty rather than argument." Jackson nodded. "Sir, I learned as musician that you can't argue someone into feeling differently, but you can play music that makes them feel something new. Once they feel it, the intellectual understanding follows." The music sessions expanded to include live performances. Jackson recruited other Black soldiers stationed at Camp Clinton who had musical talent. They formed an impromptu blues band, performing for German POWs who had never seen live Black American music. Friedrich watched Jackson play trumpet, watched how he bent notes, how he improvised around melodic themes, how he communicated emotion through purely instrumental means. It was performance of technical skill and emotional intelligence that matched anything Friedrich had witnessed in Berlin's concert halls. After one performance, Friedrich approached Jackson. "May I ask personal question?" "Go ahead. You play with such, I do not have English word, such freedom, as if the music is being created in moment rather than executed from page. This is intentional technique?" Jackson smiled. "That's improvisation, central to jazz and blues. You have the structure, the chord changes, the basic melody. But within that structure, you're free to explore, to express yourself. It's like democracy. You have framework of laws, but within that framework, you're free to be individual. In German music, we follow the score exactly as written. To deviate is considered error. And that, Jackson said gently, is difference between authoritarian culture and democratic culture. We write the basic rules, then we improvise within them. You write everything down and demand perfect obedience. Which approach do you think produces more creativity? Friedrich had no answer, but the question lodged in his mind like a seed. Spring 1944. The war turns decisively against Germany. News of Allied advances filtered into Camp Clinton. Rome liberated, D-Day successful. Soviet armies pushing toward Germany's borders. The German POWs could no longer maintain illusions of eventual German victory. The question now was not whether Germany would lose, but how catastrophically, and what would remain afterward. In this context, the music sessions took on new meaning. They were no longer just cultural education, but preparation for the world that would exist after Nazi Germany's defeat. The prisoners began asking more practical questions. What would Germany become? What would happen to Germans who had served the Reich? Could Germany rebuild? Or was it destined to remain moral pariah? Jackson addressed these concerns through music history. He explained how blues emerged from slavery's aftermath, how Black Americans built culture and community from ruins of bondage. My people, he said, spent 250 years enslaved, then another 80 years under Jim Crow. But we created universities, businesses, art, music. We survived and we thrived despite system designed to destroy us. Germany can do the same after this war, but only if you're willing to acknowledge what was done and commit to being better. Major Koch asked, but we Germans, we followed orders, we believed our leaders. How do we reconcile this? The blues doesn't offer easy absolution, Jackson replied. It offers honest confrontation with suffering, your own and others. You don't erase guilt. You transform it into commitment to justice. You make beauty from ashes. That's the lesson. Friedrich found himself thinking about Germany's future in musical terms. Could the nation that produced Bach and Beethoven also learn to produce music of honest suffering and redemption? Could Germany develop its own version of the blues, not copying American form but finding authentic expression of national trauma and hope for transformation? He began writing essays in his journal, trying to articulate what he was learning. He wrote about how Nazi ideology had demanded perfection, racial perfection, military perfection, ideological perfection. But American blues suggested that perfection was not only impossible, but undesirable. That beauty came from flaws acknowledged and transcended. That strength came from surviving suffering rather than denying it. The Americans, he wrote, are teaching us to be human again, not supermen, not master race, but humans who suffer and hope and create beauty from both. This is the lesson I will take back to Germany if I survive this war. Summer 1944. Personal connections deepen. As months passed, the relationship between German prisoners and their American guards evolved beyond simple captor-captive dynamic. Particularly between Friedrich and Jackson, a genuine friendship emerged, complicated by their circumstances but real nonetheless. Jackson taught Friedrich to play basic blues progressions on a beat-up guitar the camp provided. Friedrich, classically trained in piano, struggled with the informal, feeling-based approach to music. His fingers wanted to find correct notes. Jackson taught him to find true notes instead. You're thinking too much, Jackson said during one lesson. Blues isn't about playing right notes, it's about playing notes that mean something. Feel it. Don't think it. Friedrich tried to explain. In German music education, we are taught precision. Correct pitch, correct rhythm, correct interpretation of composer's intent. What you describe sounds like chaos. It's not chaos. It's freedom within structure. Big difference. You still have the progression, 12-bar blues, I, VU, V chord changes. But how you express those changes, what notes you choose, how you bend them, that's your voice, your story. The structure gives you foundation. Your feeling gives you freedom. It was a lesson that extended beyond music. Friedrich began to understand how democracy could function. Shared agreement on basic framework. Individual freedom within that framework. It contradicted everything he'd been taught about how societies must be organized. One evening, Friedrich asked Jackson the question that had been troubling him. When war ends, when I return to Germany, what should I do with what I have learned here? Jackson considered carefully before answering. You tell truth. You teach that strength comes from acknowledging weakness, that beauty comes from suffering honestly expressed, that diversity creates rather than destroys culture. You teach that people your ideology deemed inferior created art that people like you respect and love. That's the revolution. Not political, but human. Many Germans will not want to hear this. Many white Americans don't want to hear that Black Americans created their greatest cultural achievement. But truth doesn't need permission. You just speak it and let it work. Friedrich nodded slowly. I think perhaps the blues is teaching me to be better German. Not the German of Nazi ideology, but German who acknowledges our failures and works to transcend them through honest confrontation with truth. Now, Jackson said with a smile, you understand the blues, not just as music, but as way of being human. Spring 1945. The war ends. Reckonings begin. News of Germany's surrender reached Camp Clinton in May 1945, followed shortly by reports of concentration camps liberated, the full horror of Nazi crimes revealed. The mood among German POWs shifted from resignation to shame as photographs and testimonies documented the Holocaust. Friedrich confronted the unbearable reality. He had served a regime that committed industrialized genocide. He had fought honorably by military standards but in service of monstrous ideology. The blues had taught him about acknowledging suffering, but this suffering was on a scale that seemed beyond any possibility of redemption through acknowledgement. Jackson found Friedrich alone in the barracks, staring at newspaper photographs from Dachau and Auschwitz. The corporal sat down beside the German officer without speaking for several minutes. I don't know what to say, Friedrich finally admitted. I knew there were camps. I knew Jews were being persecuted. But this, I did not know the scale. Or perhaps I chose not to know. That choosing not to know, Jackson said quietly, is what the blues fights against. The blues is music that refuses to look away from suffering, forces you to see it, name it, carry it, transform it. How can this be transformed? How can Germany ever be redeemed? Same way Black Americans seek redemption for America's slavery, by acknowledging what was done, by committing to never doing it again, by working every day to build something better from the ruins. It doesn't erase the crime, but it honors the victims by refusing to repeat the crime. Friedrich looked at Jackson with something like desperation. Will you teach me more? Before I am repatriated, will you teach me everything you can about how people survive and transcend this kind of historical guilt? For the next 3 months, until German POWs began being repatriated, Jackson gave Friedrich an intensive education. More music, but also books about American history, slavery, Reconstruction, the ongoing struggle for justice. He introduced Friedrich to the concept of truth and reconciliation, the idea that societies can face terrible histories honestly and still move forward. Your country needs its own version of the blues, Jackson said during their final conversation. Not copying our music, but finding authentic German way to express honest suffering and hope for transformation. You understand music. Maybe you can help create that. Friedrich gripped Jackson's hand in farewell. You have given me more than musical education. You have given me moral framework for living after unforgivable crimes. I will try to deserve this gift. Germany, 1946 to 1950. Friedrich returns to ruins and tries to rebuild. Friedrich returned to Germany that autumn, to a nation physically and morally destroyed. Munich, his home city, was rubble. His family had survived but lived in conditions of desperate poverty. The psychological landscape was even worse. Collective guilt, collective denial, collective silence about what had been done. He began teaching music, first in refugee camps, then in schools that were slowly reopening. But he taught differently than he had been taught. He introduced blues and jazz alongside Bach and Beethoven, explaining that these were not separate traditions but related expressions of human experience, one born from suffering under totalitarian slavery, the other from suffering under democratic imperfection. His students asked why they should learn music of the victors, music of America. Friedrich answered, we learn it because it teaches us what we need to know, that beauty can emerge from suffering. That diversity strengthens rather than weakens culture. That acknowledging pain is stronger than denying it. These are lessons Germany needs. He wrote articles for small cultural magazines, carefully advocating for openness to American music as part of Germany's cultural reconstruction. Some dismissed him as defeatist. Others recognized the wisdom in what he proposed. By 1950, Friedrich had established a small music school in Munich that taught both classical European tradition and American blues and jazz. He invited Black American musicians stationed in occupied Germany to give masterclasses, creating connections that began to heal cultural wounds. He maintained correspondence with Jackson, who had returned to Chicago and resumed his music career. The letters documented parallel journeys: Jackson working for civil rights in America, Friedrich working for democratic culture in Germany, both fighting the good fight, each in their own context. In one letter, Friedrich wrote, "You taught me that music is more than entertainment or technical achievement. It is testimony to human experience, evidence of human capacity to survive and create beauty despite circumstances designed to destroy us. I am teaching this to young Germans who need to understand that our national failure was not destiny, but choice, and that better choices are possible. The blues has become my template for moral education." Jackson wrote back, "You've understood the deepest lesson. The blues isn't about being Black or American. It's about being human in situations that try to strip your humanity. Germany can have its own blues now, not our music, but your honest expression of suffering and hope. That's the beginning of real rebuilding." Munich, 1952. 7 years after the war. A concert that defines transformation. Friedrich organized a concert unlike any Germany had seen. Blues and Bach, a concert of reconciliation. Half the program was classical German works. Half was American blues and jazz performed by both Black American musicians and German musicians Friedrich had trained. The auditorium was packed with skeptics and believers. Older Germans who thought it was betrayal of tradition and younger Germans hungry for new cultural framework that wasn't tainted by Nazism. Jackson came from Chicago to perform, bringing several musicians with him. Major Koch attended, now a civilian working in German educational reform, committed to the values he'd learned in that Mississippi POW camp. The concert began with Bach's Air on the G string, traditional, safe, beautiful. Then Friedrich introduced Jackson, who performed St. Louis blues with such emotional power that the audience sat in stunned silence. Friedrich spoke between pieces, explaining in German what the audience was hearing. This music was created by people who suffered under a system of racial oppression, but they did not let that suffering destroy them. They transformed it into art that now speaks to all humanity. We Germans have also suffered, some deservedly, some as victims of ideology we allowed to control us. We can also transform our suffering into honest art. But first, we must learn from those who have already walked this path. The concert continued. Beethoven followed by Billie Holiday, Mozart followed by Duke Ellington. The juxtapositions were intentional, showing that high culture and folk culture, European tradition and American innovation, classical composition and blues improvisation were not opposites, but complements. At the climax of the concert, Friedrich and Jackson performed together, a blues improvisation built on Bach's chord progressions. It was musical synthesis of everything Friedrich had learned, that tradition and innovation, structure and freedom, European and American, could create something neither could achieve alone. When the last note faded, the audience was silent for 10 seconds that felt eternal. Then applause began, tentative at first, then building, then becoming a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes. Koch approached Friedrich afterward, eyes damp. "You did it. You found way to teach what cannot be taught through lectures. You used music to show that Germany can acknowledge its crimes and still create beauty, that we can learn from those we once despised, that redemption is possible through honest confrontation with truth." Friedrich shook his head. "Jackson did it. The blues did it. I just helped translate." Decades later, the legacy persists and grows. Friedrich von Steinberg continued teaching in Munich until his retirement in 1978, training 2 generations of German musicians in both classical tradition and blues sensibility. Many of his students became influential in German popular music, bringing understanding of blues and jazz into German cultural mainstream. The music school he founded still operates, now called the Friedrich von Steinberg Institute for Cross-Cultural Music Education. Its motto, suggested by Jackson in a letter, "Beauty from ashes, sound from silence." William Jackson returned to Chicago, where he played professionally until his death in 1982. He spoke frequently about his experiences teaching blues to German POWs, explaining it as the most important gigs I ever played. He maintained that music could achieve what politics could not, human recognition across barriers of history and hatred. The relationship between Friedrich and Jackson, maintained through letters for 40 years, became case study in universities teaching reconciliation and peace studies. Their correspondence documented how personal connection and cultural exchange could transform enemies into friends, how acknowledgement of suffering could become foundation for healing. Major Werner Koch went on to lead educational reform in Bavaria, incorporating arts education and cross-cultural understanding into curriculum. He credited the POW camp music sessions with teaching him that strength comes not from cultural purity, but from willingness to learn from other cultures, especially those we once dismissed as inferior. The broader impact of what happened at Camp Clinton, German officers confronting African American culture and recognizing its depth, beauty, and moral instruction, became template for numerous cultural exchange programs during Cold War and beyond. The idea that shared humanity could be recognized through art even when politics divided became central to diplomacy and reconciliation efforts. Friedrich's final interview, given at age 90 in 1995, summarized the lesson. The blues taught me that suffering acknowledged and transformed is more powerful than suffering denied. Nazi Germany denied its victims suffering and demanded German racial perfection. American blues acknowledges suffering and creates beauty from imperfection. I learned which approach produces better humans, better culture, better society. I have spent 50 years trying to teach others that lesson. William Jackson, in his last recorded interview in 1981, said simply, "I played blues for German soldiers in Mississippi, and some of them heard it, really heard it. Music did what war couldn't, made us see each other as human. That's why the blues exists, to remind us we're all human, all suffering, all trying to make something beautiful from the pain. War transforms understanding. Music transcends hatred, and truth communicated through beauty can heal what politics breaks." If this story made you reflect on how art can bridge seemingly unbridgeable divides and how acknowledging suffering becomes path to redemption, share it, because what we understand about music's power to reveal shared humanity, we never forget.